Today we're going to examine, does history have a meaning? To this end, we'll look at a number of great visionaries, thinkers and historians. For example, Hegel, Karl Marx, Pitirim Sorokin, Andrew Marr, Yuval Harari and Arnold Toynbee. Let's look at Hegel first, who presented world history as something that followed the dictates of reason. He thought of it as the outworking of an absolute spirit. The development of the spirit's consciousness and realization of its own freedom is the meaning of history for Hegel. Freedom is the great word that he uses, and of course many features of the development of Western democracies and the Western spirit have been around this concept of freedom, which Hegel would have understood as a development of the inner spirit expressing itself in history. Karl Marx, who followed shortly after Hegel, believed that societies, rather than being the expression of an absolute spirit, are an oppressed majority and an oppressive minority. There is a class struggle within society. States, the governments, are run on behalf of the ruling class. Capitalism produces internal tensions leading to self-destruction and replacement by communism. Marx provided a huge vision, giving people a sense of orientation, a sense where history was moving, and a sense of justice at the end of history. Rather religious actually, or spiritual vision, but he had a theory of materialism that differed from other philosophers that he had thoroughly worked out. The key to history was material change, technology, class struggle and evolution. Pitirim Sorokin escaped the Russian Revolution. He had a death sentence from the Tsar and also from Lenin. He was between a rock and a hard place, but he just about escaped, and he was a brilliant man and became a professor at Harvard. He was a sociologist but also an historian, and had not only the examples of the Russian Revolution which he had lived through, but also his wide knowledge of history. He proposed that throughout history various cultures were following one after the other. For example, a sensate or materialistic culture such as capitalism has been evident in lots of periods of history. The Roman Empire is another example. Ideational or spiritual cultures are in opposition to the sensate cultures and can often follow them. So the Middle Ages and the dominance of the church had strong ideational or spiritual cultural elements which downplayed materialist values, the search for money and so on, and uplifted ideas of God and spirit and renunciation in the case of the Christian church in the Middle Ages. An integral culture was his third example, which is somewhere between the two, between sensate and ideational, in which, for example, in the Renaissance, you could get elements of both, where you get strong materialistic development, but also you get strong spiritual, artistic and aesthetic developments occurring at the same time. Clearly the integrational culture is the most preferable, but if you look at history, you can see violent movements between the sensate and ideational. Just look at capitalist culture today, strongly sensate, and Islamic culture, strongly ideational in some key parts of it. You see they're reacting against one another. And Pitirim Sorokin viewed history as a dynamic and a movement between these different types of cultures. So it gives you an idea that perhaps even after capitalism there could be an ideational culture which could follow it, possibly. Sorokin identified the disintegration of the current sensate order, and this was in the 1940s and 50s, where he wrote many books on this subject. And he pointed to positive transformational processes within the period he was living in. For example, the growing importance of developing nations or the League of Nations. He would have certainly pointed in the 1960s to the alternative society, the alternative vision that developed as examples of movements towards a non-sensate culture, one that was more ideational. The next person we look at, the next historian, is Andrew Marr, who has written a recent book on world history. And in that he develops a philosophy that there's a vast technological gap between modern and ancient peoples. And human nature, he claims, has changed very little since the very beginning. Certainly, corruption and warfare are constant. He states that there's no abstract forces of history and that progress comes through pure effort, willpower and muscle. Nothing is inevitable or determined. However, he notes that great individuals can be the decisive makers of history. Who could deny the importance of Napoleon or Hitler, for example? No biological change of any significance has taken place in the period of civilizations. Wealth, he suggests, is the result of specialization. Not only he suggests, but Adam Smith, of course, has suggested it long ago. And it's also the result of technology, not just the result of greater intelligence. In fact, he gives some evidence and suggestion that we've become as individuals less intelligent than we were as foragers, as hunter-gatherers. But as a result of our specialization in our technologies, we have more intelligence in society and in our technological artifacts, but not in our individual selves. So much of history is obviously determined by nature, he suggests, volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, climate change, and still is, and ominously maybe in the very near future, with climate change being the major part of the agenda. Later, after evidence of the natural impact of the upon mankind of natural forces, the next major influence upon human beings is of the human beings. Wars, revolutions, hierarchies, class struggle, invasions and so on. And so this is simply one of the greatest impacts that can happen to a human society. Being overrun, for example, the Roman Empire was after all overrun by other human beings. Humans have also attacked nature, undermining our sustainable foundations. There is an incredible amount of aggression in our species, he suggests, and sometimes this can bring about positive change. History is the fragments that survive from a vast buried story, and civilization is impermanent and has required gigantic efforts to build and maintain it. In the last part of his book, Marr mentions the financial crisis, the development of artificial intelligence, and the ecological problems of the earth. The next historian we examine is Harari, Yuval Harari, who's produced a wonderful book recently called Sapiens. Human consciousness mysteriously arises out of evolution from increasing brain size. He takes the traditional view on the development of consciousness in this respect, a materialist view. He regards it as a branching tree of advanced consciousness carriers, Homo sapiens, which then narrows to a single species, which is rather unusual, isn't it? Because in most species there's a fanning out process. There's many dogs, many cats, many lizards, many birds and so on. But human beings, after being quite numerous, at least 5 of us at the very beginning of our evolution 200,000 years ago, basically we had cousins like the Neanderthals and so on, but gradually we've either wiped them out or they've disappeared, and the consciousness carriers, Homo sapiens, have narrowed down to one species, ourselves. 4 milestones of consciousness are suggested by Harari and by many others. The cognitive revolution around 60,000 years ago, when we can see from the human artifacts that there was a significant leap in human intelligence. The agricultural revolution of about 10,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago actually, but it occurred at different points in stages in different parts of the world, was obviously a huge leap in human evolution, capability, and also in human intelligence, to have figured out how seeds work and how irrigation works, and generated vast increases in population and in food supply. And thirdly, the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, right up to our own period, which is a milestone of consciousness. He suggests that there is an arrow of history rather than a meaning to history. This arrow, this where history is directed, is to greater size and unification. It's a development of a universal order. For example, a monetary order developed thousands of years ago, by which gold and silver could facilitate trade on a global basis. An imperial order, whereby great empires, the Roman empires in the west, for example, and the Chinese empire in the east, covering vast territories, so that most human beings have grown up in some kind of empire situation. Also the development of universal religions from an early period previously where mankind had been basically in an animistic situation with gods of the river, gods of the mountain and so on, local gods, suddenly around 2000, 3000 BC, and right up to the period of Jesus Christ, we find these developments of universal religions in which there is suddenly a religion for virtually the whole of humanity. This signifying some development of our consciousness, obviously, whereby mankind realizes that there is a unity and a singleness to human consciousness. Also, the development of a comparable or identical geopolitical system across the world. After all, if you take the scientific revolution, science has spread right across the world, has it not? Medicine has spread right across the world. You would expect to walk into a cancer clinic in America or in Australia and receive roughly the same treatment, because this knowledge, this scientific knowledge, is being passed around the world. And that's just one example out of thousands one could give. Yet, suggests Toynbee, there is a mysterious quality that leads civilization forward. And instead of more facts to describe this, he searches for myth and metaphor. For example, the metaphor of a rock climber, which goes from stage to stage, from one, as it were, shelf to another shelf, higher up the rock face. An incredible achievement, but to get to the next level of civilization, but may get stuck there or may even fall. But civilization is a very difficult task and requires something as heroic as a rock climber climbing a very steep and difficult rock face. Or, by way of myth, the sower and the seed, by which the seed, which is the seed of civilization, is sown by the great intelligence, the inherent force within the human species, but sometimes it falls on shallow soil. Sometimes it falls on soil which has no rain, has no sustenance. And sometimes it falls on good soil and has adequate nutrients and water and grows into a fine plant. However, it is still subject to attack and to diseases and so on, but it can grow into a very significant, in some cases, tree or vegetation. So the sower and the seed, taken from the Bible, we find Toynbee searching for an extra dimension to history, whereby there is something within the human species leading it forward, which can't quite be described as simply the struggle of opposites in history. Yes, there is a struggle of opposites, but he would refer to something at a grander scale, almost cosmic. For example, he refers to the yin and the yang of history. This was in the 1940s and 50s, when such concepts were not so well known in the West. The victory and the defeat, the eternal battle between death and life, and the movement to rebirth in history, not just in individuals, but in whole civilizations at a higher level. Just think of Chinese civilizations across thousands of years, which has continually been reborn and is still here. The rhythm of creation and destruction he detects across history, and he calls it the great wheel of history and the rhythm of creation and destruction. So these are some of the thinkers we examine on what is the meaning of history.